but I should open it. Hola. Good evening. Does it work? Yes. Benvinguts, benvingudes, welcome. It's a pleasure to present and discuss this book by Stephen Smith, which has been translated into Spanish, La huida, hacia Europa, la joven África en marcha hacia el viejo continente. This book has been published by Editorial ARPA, who are also here, so thank you very much as well to propose this book and this event. Many of you may know already Stephen Smith, but let me introduce him very briefly. Stephen Smith is an American biographer, editor, journalist, and writer. He is a former editor of the French daily newspaper Libération. He has also worked for other media, such as Le Monde, Radio France, and Reuters agency, particularly in West and Central Africa. Apart from writing many articles, Smith has also written several books on Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Cote d'Ivoire, and Somalia. And he has also written several biographies. That's why I said that he's also a biographer on particularly notable African people, among them, for instance, Winnie Mandela. This book, which is also there, got the prize for the best book on geopolitics by the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And while it has been highly honored and valued, it has been also object of several controversies and discussions. Why did we think that it was important to present and discuss this book here at CIDOB? Well, first of all, because we are expanding our area of expertise to Africa, to sub-Saharan Africa here at CIDOB. As you know, CIDOB is well known for its expertise on the Mediterranean, on the Middle East, on North Africa. Migration and migration policies are also a key pillar of our research agenda. And our diagnosis is that more and more we cannot talk about the Mediterranean, about the Middle East, about North Africa, about migration, both globally and in the European context, without looking farther south, without looking as well to sub-Saharan Africa. A few months ago, we organized a seminar on the Sahel, and we are now starting a new EU-funded research project on the global governance of migration, with a particular focus on the origin and transit countries. But coming back to the book, from CIDOB, we think we should not escape sensitive controversies. It's, as I said, it has been, and it is a controversial book, basically because announcing or predicting flight towards Europe in the current political context with increasing populist, xenophobic, and nativist discourses is not neutral and may have some implications, but we believe we should not escape these controversies, these discussions. We should discuss instead them from an analytical point of view, contrasting facts and different perspectives. And we do believe that CIDOB can play this function. We can offer space to discuss all these issues and to discuss them, as I said, as far as possible from the noise that dominates the media and political debates. And precisely with this aim, with the aim of being analytical and tackling these controversies, but also these important issues directly, we invited, and we are very pleased as well to have here Rafa Vilasanjuán. Rafa Vilasanjuán is, as you may know, many of you I'm sure know him, is as well a journalist. He worked for more than 12 years at MSF, at Médecins Sans Frontières, Médicos Sin Fronteras, first as communication director, and later as general director of the Spanish section. In 1999, he was nominated General Secretary of the International Movement. He has worked in conflict zones in Afghanistan, Chechen Republic, Somalia, Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Colombia, and Iraq. He has also been Deputy Director of CCCB, the Centre de Cultura Contemporània de Barcelona, and he is at present Director of Analysis and Development of the ISGlobal, in Spanish, which is an institute on global health that tackle the main health challenges in a globalized world. He just published a book on the refugee crisis in Europe, and in this book, which just came out, he points precisely to all those crises that cross Europe nowadays. Having said that, let's start the discussion. I'll try to pose questions and to follow the debate. Stephen, what led you to write this book, and what is the main argument of the book?
Hello, good evening. I'm very unfortunate not to speak Spanish sufficiently well enough to talk to you in Spanish, so I regret that very much. I actually started my European languages. I first learned Spanish and was, don't believe me, to take my word for it, quite good at it, but then I decided that my future lay in Paris, and when I got a little bit better in French, my Spanish disappeared, so apologies for that. I actually wanted to write a book that would not have been remarked, I'm afraid, because I was very much interested and have been interested for almost 10 years, and I signed the initial contract with the French publisher, which is also the reason why the French book came out in French prior to the English version, which comes out at the end of this month, because I had signed a contract to write a book about the young Africa. I'm very much interested, and I think those who had an opportunity to read the book will see that I actually use the migration to talk a lot about young Africa. There is a fundamental fact in Africa that 40% on a continental level, 40% of the population is under the age of 15. Just imagine what that means. I think I know for Berlin, for Paris and London is 18%, Rome is, and Berlin is 13.5% of people under the age of 15. So it's twice as many in Africa on a continental level, and North Africa is older, and southern Africa as well. So it's mainly 35 countries south of the Sahara. When you factor in that in cities, because people move from the rural areas to cities, mostly young people, I give you the extreme example. Lagos, 21 million inhabitants, 60% of the population is younger than 15 years. And I was interested in the question, what does that actually mean? What does it mean for the transmission of values and norms in a society where there is no mentorship, where most young people have only the peer experience? They are pioneers. What does it mean for democracy? Is it easy? Is it easier to have democracy? Think about democracy. Voting age in Africa is 18 years as well. More than 50% of the population is not concerned by democracy. Democracy in Africa is an age privilege. It's not so all these questions, and obviously the only ones who had thought about that were people from the CIA in the United States, security people, because they were thinking about what does it mean when you have such a youthful population for peace and stability. And so I was trying to get that question out of the security community and put it into the broader public and think about it in broader terms. I'll give you just a very quick example. You probably all know that 2/3 of people who are affected by AIDS, HIV, are Africans. And when you ask the question, when I'm in my classroom, I ask my students, why would 2/3 of people affected? I mean, that many people die of AIDS in Africa, you could say it's the public health sector, perhaps, etc. But why would a virus be more represented in Africa than somewhere else? It's a heterosexual disease, so why? And usually we tiptoe around it. You know, some people think it's an African disease, but it's not an African disease. The reason is Africa is the most youthful part of the world, and young people, I'm afraid to say, because it's not a pleasant avowal to make, young people have more sex than elderly people, and so the possibility of contracting AIDS is just statistically among other reasons, higher in Africa. So the youthfulness of Africa is actually what I was interested in. I didn't write the book because I moved from Paris with my family to the United States, became an academic and had other things to do. Grasset, my publisher, said, when will you write the book? Then 2015 happened, 1 million people came to Europe, and my publisher said, so here you are, you missed the boat. And I said, but I want to write about migration, not about refugees, and that's very, very different. And so eventually I wrote the book in 2017 and it came out in February 2018. It will be out. I rewrote it in English last summer, and so it will be out in English at the end of this month. I think that was a long answer to a short question. Sorry for that. Thank you.
And Rafa, you have written on the refugee crisis in Europe. From this perspective, what are the main arguments you would like to highlight from Smith's book?
Well, first of all, I should say that it's a luxury to have Stephen Smith here, because when I started to be in Africa, before going to Africa, I read Stephen Smith. So he was writing in Libération at that time, so people told me, well, you know, if you want to have such an argument like how is the colors of Africa and so on, go to Kapuscinski. Then if you want to know what's going on in between the different tensions and so on, then you go to Stephen Smith. So just for most of you who are thinking about the non-African writers of Africa, because there are many African writers, which I also tend to recommend to the people, but for me was a kind of reference. First thing, second thing, and this is his book right now, and this is what we are talking today. I found it very, very interesting, because I think that nobody such as Stephen Smith can write this book, because in a way we need these kind of arguments which are shaking society in terms of saying, be careful. There are questions that we might consider in a different manner than the ones that we are doing today. And one of these questions is demography. And demography means not the number of growth, it means also the different scales of the population. So youth people in Africa, it's a big issue right now. How we will be dealing, how we will be coping with that. Well, first, how Africa would be coping with that, and then how we will be perceiving the influence of that. So I think that out of his arguments, I think that for me what is really interesting is to say, let's take this debate without the passion of whether you are from the right or from the left, and then let's go to the issues which are here. I have some concerns, and probably during the night we'll have some time to go into details. But what is interesting for me, well, first of all, and at a certain point in your book, Stephen, you say clearly, the ones who are fleeing violence, we should be taking care of them, and that's skip out of this debate. And that I understood from your pages, and it's very well written here, which is something that I fully agree. The main invasion of people in Europe, as we said, invasion, in 2015, which is the only year in which we had a peak of more than 1 million people coming, they were coming from a conflict. Most of them, they were coming from Syria, some of them from Afghanistan, some of them from parts of Somalia and so on, but mainly they were coming from Syria. The big point about that is, in a way, it's very difficult to differentiate in between refugees and immigrants. Migration is the word, but how do you consider a person, like it is written here, that starts his trip in Ghana or in Nigeria, and then comes to Libya, and then gets enslaved there, and then it tries to come to Europe? Is this a refugee? Is he fleeing violence, or is he just coming for immigration? I think that there is something on the way to think that we need to better explain to our politicians, because at the end of the day, they are the ones that making decisions, and probably the CIA and NATO and some other organism, they will try to plan in more than 4-year term, but the decision makers are just having an agenda for 4-year term. And that's how you can get this book and say, well, if I am a extreme right leader, I would be saying, be careful, this is what is coming. And Stephen is saying more than 100 million would be coming here to Europe, or they could be coming here. I'm not saying they are coming, they could be coming here because of the demography in Africa. Well, that's one issue. Let's take it. From my perspective, there are concerns there in terms of whether this, and you are pointing out also in the book, whether this would be true or not. That's a question, we will see. It's clear right now that we have some economic concerns there that we need to analyze. What most frightening for me, what I have seen in this book, is the fact that there is one thesis there which I tend to have arguments, which is whether we will need them or not. And probably this is one of the elements for me. Welcome if we need them. I think that we will need to develop Europe in a different manner than the one that we are doing. And my real concern is that we don't have migration plans at all. We are dealing with this fifth scenario that you are saying in your book, which is use a bit of everything. A bit of security, a bit of walls, a bit of borders, a bit of way of thinking in goodwill, and say, well, all the Africans welcome and so on. And at the end of the day, the fact is that there is no Europe for migration. There are countries for migration. And that's my biggest point of reading that at the end of the day.
Stephen, maybe you want to answer him or to reply to him, and then I follow with the next question.
Okay, good. First of all, I think it's very important to make the distinction between asylum seekers and migrants, at least in our head. How we do that practically is another question. And asylum, in my understanding, is very traditional. In Rome, when you came as a foreigner and you were looking for asylum, there were no questions asked. You took a handful of the land where you came from, you threw it into a ditch, and then you became a Roman. And that's what it is. Asylum, someone who is persecuted and comes to Europe, should be given asylum as no questions asked, in that absolute sense that anyone who is under threat for his or her life should be welcome. Now, the difficulty obviously is, and I skirted around that in my book, I didn't make any distinction between legal and illegal immigrant. I didn't want to get into the questions of how do you practically distinguish someone who is persecuted from someone who seeks better life chances. Both is legitimate. If I were African today, and I will come back to that, living in Senegal, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Kenya, or South Africa, which are precisely the countries we are hoping for, of which we think that they will have a better future. It's not the basket cases. People who migrate come from the threshold countries. If I were a citizen of one of these countries, I had a family, I were looking for better life chances for myself and my children, I would migrate. That's a given. And that also means that I turn my back on my country. We usually consider the migrant only in the heroic phase where, you overcome obstacles, you cross the Mediterranean, you come to Europe, and that's very heroic. The first act of any migrant, and that would be my case as well, is defeatism. You give up on your country. You give up, you have no hope that within your lifetime, the situation in Senegal will be good enough for you to stay in Senegal. And so you leave your country. So we have to see the entire sequence. Now, I perfectly understand that people migrate, but that should not prevent us from also seeing the point of view of the interest of the country that you leave behind and the interest of the country where you try to go to, and where you have to become, you're first a foreigner, you become a neighbor, you become a fellow citizen. And the collective work that is necessary to turn someone from a foreigner to a good neighbor and to a good fellow citizen is a lot of work by the migrants and work for the hosts. Both of them have to work. And if you look at Europe, and you look not only at the first generation, but also the second generation, the type of problems that we have, despite different approaches, the multicultural approach in Great Britain, the normative universalism in France, you have your own problems in this country. I think we cannot talk away the fact that migration is linked to challenges. Challenges for the migrants and challenges for lack of a better word, I will say hosts, or the host society, which itself is composed of migrants and people who were born in the country. This work I tried not to talk away. And so in the book, obviously, you will understand that migration comes with challenges, and I really think that they are on both sides. I have spoken to many, many migrants. I spend most of my time with Africans and less with Europeans, so I'm actually less interested in all the question of how are we going to cope with this, and rather with what the migrants feel. The migrants, at the end of the day, very often when they are successful, they still say things like, I earn a better living, but do I actually live better here? Am I happier? And very often the parents decide it's worthwhile staying because it'll be better for my children. It is not as if people come fleeing Africa like a hell and coming to Europe and that's paradise. That's not how it is. It's very ambivalent, and it's very difficult to know at the end of a migrant's life whether you made the right decision to actually leave your country, leave the place where you are 100% what you think you are, and come to a place where you always have to compromise and you hope that your children will grow into that new reality. And there's nothing African about it. I'm married to a French woman, and she is very difficult to export to the United States, and over a dinner table we negotiate with our children. What do we take? What do we leave? What do you accept? How far will you go? And that's a permanent process for Africans like any migrants. For me, I say that right away from the beginning so everything will be clear among us. For me, Africa is just another place in the world under specific conditions, and I see otherness, other people, as myself under different circumstances. So I try not to think about my identity or African identity. I try to investigate the circumstances that make people live in certain ways. And I think there is a common, I'm not speaking about we are all human beings and a common denominator, because people speak languages, have cultures, have different differences. These differences need to be acknowledged. But if you try to walk in the shoes of other people, I think this is the best way to understand why they act the way they act.
Can I? One of the issues which I think is very interesting on all this trip, when you say, well, the first decision of a migrant is to leave their hometown, the place. It can be, and that's also very well explained in your book, it can be most of them, and we have a lot of figures in the world saying, well, there's an invasion coming to Europe and so on. Well, in fact, there's only 1 out of 10 coming to Europe, and you are explaining very well the figures.
Out of 10 migrants, 7 stay in Africa. They're just moving from one country to another more prosperous place. And out of the 3 that right now migrate outside of Africa, now that's statistics, 1.5 comes to Europe and 1.5 goes to Arab Peninsula, United States, China, to Canada, all the rest of the world. But this 7 figure will be moving. More and more people will go into outward migration. So 30 years ago, 9 out of 10 stayed in Africa. Now it's 7, and in 20 years it'll be 5. And the overall figure is, increasing because the African population is moving from 1.3 billion now to 2.4 billion within the next 30 years. And so within that time frame, the overall number of migrants will increase, and the percentage of those who will engage in outward migration will also increase. Hence, you can expect a bigger flow of migrants.
Yeah, but that's a bit what I think it's very good to read and to understand out of these first pages of the book on the figures and the dimensions, and this would be on the changing for the future. So there would be a change, a massive change or not, that we will see. But in any case, there are some myths there that we need to discuss. I mean, we tend to say always, well, the best way to stop that is development aid. But in fact, it's not. The more development there would be there, if the gap still keeps as the biggest gap in between Europe and Africa, the more we develop, the people who are coming here are the ones that have the resources to come. You also say that in your book. So that means that the more people having some resources, the more they will be looking to go to countries in which they can have a future. So I imagine that this is part of the equation that you are proposing.
May I say something? In fact, this migration development nexus is very clear in migration studies. The higher the development or the capacity to migrate, the higher migration. I mean, this idea that the poorer they are, the more they migrate is wrong, and migration studies show it very clearly, and that's one of the things you say in your book. But I would like to raise another thing. This idea, what you said about giving up on your country, I think that when we analyze migration from Africa, we often attribute them particular desires for migration. No? And when we analyze the causes of migration, we analyze them from here. And what you said, it's very important that they often give up on their country. And this reminds me Krastev's words in his last book, After Europe. No? He says that migration is like an individual revolution made by individuals and families that want to change their countries by leaving the country instead of by changing the government. Yeah. No? That's an interesting point, and this is quite clear in your book. Is one of the arguments. But linked to that, apart from predicting important migration flows to Europe, this book is also an analysis of the situation in Africa and African countries nowadays, very much focused on democracy, but I would say on demography, but I would say even more than democracy. You also refer to culture and to gerontocracy, this class divide based on age rather than on class. No? But sometimes it seems as if democracy and culture, this gerontocracy, explain all African evils. No? Sometimes it seems in some passages as if you would be suggesting that Africa with fewer Africans could be more prosperous, meaning with more jobs, with more resources, with more access to education, even with more democracy. Is it so? Would you...
Well, you said a lot. First of all, I will definitely come back to that. But I think very often we believe, because in academia or in academic writing something is established, that it actually is understood in the media coverage of migration, for example. We read each day that people flee a difficult continent. You would even wonder whether one could live in Africa, because you get the impression everyone wants to get away from Africa, so it must be hellish over there. Then you don't understand why other people go there and can live there and be very happy there. And that quite a few people live in very undramatic circumstances in Africa. But when you have that picture of people turning their back on a reality that is unsustainable, to put it mildly, then you would expect that these people are really poor. And what poor and rich is in our countries and poor and rich in Africa are two very different things. I just very often think about when you read in the development literature, people live on $1 or $2 a day. You read this and you say, oh, that's very little. But what does it actually mean to get up in the morning and to have ahead of you for 24 hours $1? What do you actually spend them on? How do you go about? How will you survive with the dollar? There was the French Secret Service. You will think I'm linked with secret services, but a French Secret Service operative had an assignment of staying 3 months in a Kinshasa family to find out what it actually means to live on $1. I'm saying that because we know that it is the African middle class that is leaving. Obviously, some people flee, like from Somalia or South Sudan, but let's take the refugees, put them to the side. The migrants come from these countries like Ivory Coast, Senegal, and these are middle-class people, because to get on your way, not to reach Europe, but to get on your way, you need something like 3,000 euros. It depends from where you depart, etc. But in general, 3,000 euros, even a rich, relatively prosperous country like Senegal, the per capita yearly income is $2,300 right now. So you would just think of if you wanted to migrate, you would need what you earn in a year, not spending anything. You would just need to save that money, and you would need 1.5 times what you earn in a year, so you could start to migrate. That explains why it is the people, the middle class, the emerging people who earn between $5 and $20 a day, they can only think about moving. And on top of that, if you're a villager and you've never heard about Paris, London, or New York, you will need to have some idea of the world before you can migrate. You don't migrate when you've never been in your capital. You need to have something like call it a vista of the world. And so the media, the internet, the fact that people watch satellite TV, that half of Africa now has 4G mobile telephony, all this is important for migration. It's not the underdog who migrates. Otherwise, we would have had a lot of migration in the 1990s. Half of Africa was in civil war, but people did not massively migrate. They fled to the neighboring country and went back to their country. Migration is linked, as you said, to prosperity. I was very long on that, but between saying something and fully understanding what is behind as a life experience, there's a huge gap. That's why we need so much time, and it's always a little bit desperate to try to explain things, because if you go a little bit into details, it takes a long time. Now, you asked me about, would Africa be better off if there were less Africans? That sounds terrible, because it sounds like as if I wanted half of Africa to disappear. But you cannot deny that in a country like Niger, where on average, the fertility rate for a woman is 6.7 children. Obviously, when you have a demographic growth rate of more than 3%, you need economic growth rates that these countries can never attain because the population is just, there is too many people, and you divide what you have as richness through the number of people. I give you just very global figures. In the 1930s, all of Africa, North Africa to South Africa, is 150 million people. Africa is 6.5 times greater in size than Europe. Only 150 million people. Today it's 1.3 billion. It's still not overpopulated, but given the productivity, that is that's an increase. If one of the, Great Britain or France had grown at that rate, it would be the popular Republic of China today, with 1.3 billion in France alone. And over the next 30 years, from 1.3 to 2.4 billion, in actuality, what I'm saying in the book is I have done that like any other journalist. We write about corruption, failed governance, etc. In actuality, even the director of the World Bank managing any African country would not succeed in meeting the challenge. When you have population increase of that level, which is unprecedented in human history, you have not enough money to do the demographic investments of building the schools, the roads, get the hospitals. There's not enough. It's just too many people. So yes, I'm saying that this demographic growth makes Africa poorer. And there is no family planning. I'm obviously not for anything coercive, Chinese style, but that since independence 60 years ago, there is no significant family planning in any African country. You had a lot in Asia. A small family is a happy family, whatever you try. This is not happening in Africa. It's clearly, in my mind, a responsibility of African governance. At the moment of independence, you could not say, we get rid of the colonizer and now let's grow smaller in number. That was not possible. But 60 years after independence, still not have a family planning policy, a public policy of family planning, that is a big responsibility. And even if you had one today, nothing would change because demographic changes are so slow that by 2050, we would still have 2.4 billion. So we're talking about something that is far away, and we are far behind.
Stephen, that clearly it's one of the arguments that really was impressive when you put these comparisons about what would be France at the same rate and so on. My question is, we were like that in Europe in the 80s. We were having fertility rates of 5, 6, and so on. Then industrialization, then the woman coming into work, then family planning, then all these issues went to down to one. It's under 2, which is below the demographic parameter and so on. If we take, for example, Morocco in the last 30 years has almost half its fertility rate, and that's probably the north of Africa. All the demography has done this change in epidemiology, in infectious diseases, going to chronic diseases, and having a kind of a pyramid of people with a lot of young people, not probably that much below 15, but that much below 30, because as you said, demography is going very slow. So up till the time when you start to have results for the most of Africa, that would be 2050. But this happened. So I wonder whether all this population at a certain point would develop the productivity in Africa or not. And that's a question.
2 quick things. I hope I will be quick. First, of course, Europe did that. But Europe did it between 1880 and the end of the First World War. 200 million Europeans became 300 million Europeans over 40 years, and 60 million migrated, 42 million to the Americas, mostly North America. So, of course, Europe did that. Mexico did it, every society that went through the demographic transition did it. But there's something in your argument that I do not share. We don't expect usually we don't expect Africa to follow the development line of Europe or other parts of the world. Otherwise you would need to say industrializing Great Britain polluted a lot, and today industrializing China could pollute as much. No. History goes on and things change. Latin America went through the demographic transition much faster than the Europeans did. It was the same sort of development, but much faster. Africa will go through its demographic transition fairly quickly as well. But to say they will replicate and let us just wait until they do what we have done in the past, I think that's not something that you can have as a policy. You need to take, if you had the French Revolution, the British invented democracy not to decapitate their king. You learn from history and you have to adapt. You cannot just say, I replicate and go there, and you don't. Africa jumped directly without having the telephone lines drawn. They jumped to mobile telephony. So you don't replicate with the precedents. So I think Africa will have to do something about its demographic transition that must be different from Europe and other places.
Coming back to this focus on demography, while reading the book I was thinking there are countries densely populated with very limited resources and at the same time quite prosperous. So what are the reasons behind?
You think of what country?
I'm thinking about the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Very small country, densely populated, few natural resources, but still quite prosperous. So for me, and that was one of the things that posed me more questions about this book, demography alone does not explain this limited access. And you say it, but you focus particularly on demography. What are the other causes of this limited access to social services, healthcare, land? And here I was posing the question, do Africans alone explain the cause of their problems? What about colonialism and post-colonialism, extractivism, expulsions created by what Sassen calls dead land and dead water? This is not just about demography, and this is part of the reasons behind possible migratory movements.
Yes, but if you say poverty is one of the reasons of migration, you enter into contradiction with your previous argument, which is that it is the middle class, we should have had more. So I'm not trying to explain why Africa is poor. I'm not trying to talk away the legacy of colonialism. That is not, I'm trying to describe young Africa. And I'm not even talking, I think you will give me credit for that, I'm not spending the book saying there will be more and more Africans. Africa is still not overpopulated. It's not I don't have any problem if they were 3 billion in 30 years. That would, under other circumstances, that wouldn't be a problem at all. It's not a book about there are too many Africans, we have to diminish the number of Africans, everything will be fine. There is demographic increase, we can't ignore it. More importantly, we have very youthful societies, and I tried to explain in my first statement that has many implications. So I'm interested in youthfulness. By the way, just parenthetically, if we wished to become more youthful, and that is a reason to have more migrants, that is for me a choice of society. I will come back to your argument that we don't need them for the economy. That's a different argument. But you can choose. I'd rather be in Africa surrounded by young people than be in Japan surrounded by elderly people. But that's a choice of society, my choice. Perhaps other people make other choices. That's just parenthetically. But I'm not trying to explain poverty. I explain demographic growth, youthfulness, and then very important for me, you said it's a little bit incriminating, but I think the patriarchal structures are very important. In Africa, when I want to spend my vacation with my Ivorian friend, who's really a family friend, I need to go his elder brother and see him, and at least out of politeness say, can I spend my vacation this summer with Eugène? And then his elder brother, and previously his father, would say, yes, Stephen, we know you, we know your family, you're going to spend your... So these patriarchal structures that actually make the distribution of wealth, authority, and power very unequal. It's all for elderly men. It's gerontocratic. And it excludes the young who have not a full say at the table of decision, and excludes the other dangerous half of humanity, women. And of course that may sound incriminating, but I have to say, perhaps wrongly, my tolerance, my democratic tolerance has its limits. I do think that young people should have some say, and I do think that women should have some say. So I do say that, yes, patriarchal structures in Africa are an impediment to the full, not to the happiness of people, and that's also a reason why people migrate. I will say a last word. Very often we think about migration purely in economic terms. They come to earn more money. Yes, of course they do, but they actually earn enough money to survive where they come from. Migrants come because they want more than money. They want to be part of that modernity, of that. They want to be with it, like we in America say. They want to be cutting edge. They want to be where things happen. And for me, the structure why people migrate is the same that drives people out of villages to the provincial town, to a capital, maybe to a regional hub like Nairobi or Abidjan or Lagos or Johannesburg. It is always about material things, money, living standards, but it's also, it's not fun to be in a slum in Lagos or in a big city. 2/3 of African city dwellers live in slums. They are not living better than in villages, but what is the difference? They get a glimpse of elegance. They get a glimpse of modernity. It's about adventure. People want to do something with their life. When you're 18 in a village, you would exactly know what you will be at 30. You will be married to a cousin, preferred marriage. You will be working the fields like your parents did. Everything is predictable. And at night, there is no light. You would sit over your screen on your telephone. There would be 10 or 12 children behind you, and you watch on your screen what's happening outside in the world. One day you stand up and say, I want to be there. I don't want to watch it on screen. So you move to the next provincial town, and eventually, if you have the means and you have this sort of worldview, you say, I go to Europe and seek it out by myself. It's adventure. It's almost a rite of passage. In some Senegalese villages, the girls have decided that the first choice of their husband are migrants. So anyone who has not migrated is second choice. That gives you an idea. It's not only about money and having the remittances, it's also to have someone who has seen the world, who's part of that modern world. And I think we need to understand that migration is much more than economics. It is really about the existence, and existence is not only money.
But for that, I still tend to think that there is something on the economy, a kind of layer of the economy. It's not poverty, and I agree, and we have already discussed that, but it's about equity. And I tend to think about one issue without borders. Let's say the case of Spain in the 50s and 60s. Many people came from the south, no border. They could come to Basque Country, to Catalonia, to Madrid, places where the cities were there, the main urban areas, modernity, life was there, they came, 60s, 70s, then crisis, and then they stopped to come. So something happens at the same level with what I think about migration.
Yes.
I think that there is a kind of liberalism in the way a migrant sees the capacity to immigrate and says, I have a friend in Spain or in Britain or in Germany, and they are telling me that there are opportunities for me there. So of course I've seen the CNN and all these issues in the cities, not probably in the rural areas, and then I want to be part of this modernity. So that's why I'm saying I fully agree on your thesis here in terms of saying youth are the future of Africa and might be the future of Europe as well. But then how do we manage all this? Because we know that this would be a gap. The sooner we start to reduce inequity, not poverty, inequity, the sooner people would be tending to think, I want to stay in my country. Because I also have a modern city in Abidjan or in Nairobi or in Johannesburg or whatever. So I will...
Yes, but the difficulty is the time frame. If you look at Mexico, Mexico migrated between 1975 and 2014. I mean, if you listen to Trump, they are still migrating, but they are not. And so and you don't even need to reach exactly the same level. Africa will stop to migrate well before reaching the European, if we can call it that, development level, if there is one. But because you also have the pleasure of being in your own place, all the feelings, the belonging to your own country, all that will plead in favor. But the distance is very, very far. You have to bear in mind that when I try to explain to you what it means to live on $1, you start to understand that we can't even fathom, we cannot fully imagine what it actually means, not abject poverty and hunger, but just being very poor. The banal poverty is very difficult to understand when you are as rich as we are here. And so we underestimate. We think, that will last 10 years and then it will be sufficiently well and then they will stay in their country. No, it will take 1 or 2 generations. It will not take a century, but it will take 1 or 2 generations. Given the numbers involved, that means I don't want to play around with figures because no one knows how many will come. But we are in the range of tens of millions of people who want to migrate. In many the average in Africa is that 40% declare that they would want to migrate. In some countries, it's up to 75%. And I know the difference between intention and act, but in a small country like Togo, where you have this lottery visa lottery for the United States, 1/3 of all adults have already submitted a file to emigrate. Many of my anthropological colleagues, people who write about, make field studies, they don't even bother to give you percentages any longer. They say everybody wants to leave because it's so massive. And so you have to be aware of the fact that over the next, let's say, 30, 40 years, it depends, because one of the reasons is they need to cross a threshold out of absolute poverty to have the means to migrate. But when a critical mass of Africans will migrate, and I don't say that as something that is a specter or frightening me at all. I go to Africa. The Africans are welcome to come to Europe and settle here. It's not that problem. The problem is the work, the collective work that is needed to make this a pleasant experience for everyone is just not possible for tens of millions of people. And so you see it I just come back from Berlin. Merkel and other politicians were very open-minded about migration. Now they are talking about, even the Green Party is talking about, we need to expel people. It has become the new normal. It's a reality principle. And I know that raises a lot of issues for people who have ideals about the free flow of people, but it will not be possible for Europe to just say there is migratory pressure from Africa. There will be 5 Africans for 1 European in 2050. 2050 is in 30 years. 5 Africans, 3 of them will be under 15, and there will be 1 European statistically about 10 years younger than I am, 50 roughly. That's the reality. And how do you mitigate this sort of migratory pressure without being a racist or xenophobe, but also to be realistic about what the welfare state can do? Europe has 7% of the world population. 1 out of $2 in the world that is spent on welfare, on social security, on healthcare is spent in Europe. You don't know how well you live, really. I come from America. This is cutthroat capitalism. In America, the Africans who come, and they come in numbers, 400,000 in 10 years. That's more than 3 centuries of slave trade to America. But the Africans who come to America, they know if they don't swim, they will go under. It's not like here. And in my university, the tuition fare, you have no board and lodging, is $60,000. So if I were an African father of a family, I would take my family to Europe, not to any other place. And this you need to know. People will want to come to Europe because they're looking for security, and I can understand that. But it's just impossible. And so Europe will have to reach a migratory policy, and I can't even see. I go to Brussels, I talk to the specialists, I'm invited, and they are intelligent people. It is not there's no bad intent or demonizing, but it is very, very difficult to meet this challenge. And this is a challenge for the next generation in Europe. And as we are talking just about minor refugee floods today, and when there are 500 people on the Mediterranean on a ship, we do as if it were, you know, a major challenge, a catastrophe to let these people come or not. But the bigger issues are not even, we have not even started to think about what is ahead of us. That's what I'm trying to explain.
There is a counter-argument on that, sorry, Blanca,
Sí, sí,
I don't
no.
know it, which is, you're right, it's very difficult to maintain the welfare state, but not for migration. It's very difficult because of the demography in Europe, which the fact is, when my children are saying, well, we will not be having pensions, I tell them, you're stupid, defend them, fight for them. That's what we have to do. How do we fight? For example, either we have more children, or we have more, of course, there would be a need for much more productivity. But unless there are more children here, I'm quite sure that we will not be able to keep the welfare state with or without immigration. So the problem might be whether we have to discuss on whether this welfare state is the one that we will be achieving and keeping and fighting for, and so on. Okay. My perception is that, and I'm very social democrat in my life, but I'm very liberal on immigration. I think that there won't be millions of Africans coming if there is no capacity for them to develop their capacities. Nobody wants to go to a place where there's no capacity to live.
Rafa, I would like to agree with you, but please take into account the argument that I tried to make. People are fleeing the villages and go to cities where life is hell, under a bridge in Lagos in the lagoon.
But might be better than the one they have in the rural areas.
No, they eat through their, I mean, they're still coming, and today there is telephone, people are in constant contact. They ring the villages every day. Everyone knows what life is all about. And the migrants know that there is no work for them here. They have learned that in Italy and Spain, 20% of the youth is unemployed. Still, they want to come. And it is partly because it's not only, everybody hopes, it's a little bit like the American dream. The American dream is about, I know statistically I have no chance, but I still think if I really, really try hard, it will happen. So this idea is also in their mind. But it's also really about, I'd rather be under a bridge in Paris or in Madrid than at home in my village. And no one has ever, no African government, there have been many attempts, has ever succeeded in reversing the rural exodus. Never people have gone back to the villages, even though on a day-to-day basis, living conditions in the village are better than in the cities. But you want to be where things are happening, and so we will not persuade people. Some governments ask me, should we run campaigns and tell them how life really is in Europe and how miserable they will be and how lonely, etc. And say, don't waste the money on that. Migrants are better informed. They ring each other through WhatsApp, etc. Information flows. You don't need to inform them. If they come, they have decided that they still want to come.
Before we open the floor for discussion with the audience, let me pose you both a final question. It's clear that an old Europe and a young Africa with increasing economic differences among them and shared common dreams, as you refer to it in your book, may generate migratory movements between Africa and Europe. The question is, what then? And you end the book identifying few scenarios, 4 scenarios, how to respond or what to do with it. And you may have different perspectives on that or not. Could you comment on this?
You want me first, as he's the one presenting the book, and then he can finish.
And so we have more time to think
well,
about
we will continue the discussion with the audience, so we are not finishing.
So sorry,
we still have half an hour,
just,
but I think that many people have things to say, to comment, and to ask. So that's why I would like to leave for a common discussion.
I will not advance on the 5 scenarios that Stephen is defining, because they are very well explained. Mm-hmm. And I think that at the end, he's suggesting that we can take a kind of closer look at what happened in Spain, and also a kind of mix of the scenarios that we'll be having. My perception is that migration is a challenge, of course. That shouldn't be a kind of a big secret. Everyone who knows about migration knows that there are challenges here. My idea is that we shouldn't be impressed by what happened in 2015. In 2015, there were 3 crises ongoing. at the same time when the refugees were coming. The first one, they didn't come to a rich Europe. They come to the south of Europe with a heavy crisis, with a lot of services cut by the adjustment economies of Europe and so on. So they were coming to a poor Europe, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and so on. They were having the heaviest part of this latest crisis. Second thing, we have a crisis of security. So there were terrorist attacks in Berlin, Paris, Cologne, Barcelona, Cambrils, Manchester, London, and all these issues. So many people tend to relate immigration and security. And third thing, and that's one of the issues that we might also consider out of the book of Stephen Smith, there is a crisis of identity, and ahead of globalization, many people think that we are losing identity, and they come to ultranationalist positions all over Europe. So for the first time in Europe, immigration has been the big argument to get the power. And we are seeing that in all of Europe. Even in Spain, where there was no xenophobic, let's call, party, and you mentioned that in your book, now there is one. So we have, immigration has created a kind of leverage for the ultra-right or ultra-nationalists to get into power. So I think we have to get less impressed about that and more about the issue of, as Europe, being the most ambitious space in the world, in the global agenda of free space, that we have been cutting with walls right now, with all this immigration coming and all the refugees and so on, we will need to get agreements. And we have not a single agreement on the table. That's the problem right now. Probably it can be a youth agreement. Do we want to be in a kind of geriatric, or we prefer to be in a kind of much more young society? Do we need people coming, and how much do we need these people coming? And then there should be certain agreements there. I don't think that the solutions would be anyhow the walls, my perception.
And then we open the floor.
Yeah,
for
just for the sake of discussion, I usually don't like to contradict Rafa, but just for the sake of discussion, and I think there is an atmosphere where we can do that, I would say the contrary. I'm frightened by 2015, but not because of the migrants coming, because those were refugees. In 2015, just for you to know, usually to Europe, over the last decade, 200,000 Africans came. In 2015, because the door was open, there were 300,000. So from my point of view, as a structural migration, there was nothing ultra dramatic. It was almost a normal year. People who saw that all of a sudden there was a possibility to go to Europe more easily thought, okay, I just benefit from that. That was all. But I was frightened because to see Europe so unprepared, so utterly incapable of agreeing on a few principles. Yes or no, should we have this obligation that you apply for asylum in the country where you enter? You know, the entire process where people are shipped back from Germany because they entered through Italy and then they have to go. All these nonsensical things. And we are still not done with it. So that was very frightening for me. And we have done nothing except the most repressive things. 3 million refugees were blocked by 6 billion euros that were paid to Turkey. They are now on Turkish soil. 600,000 to 800,000 sub-Saharan Africans are blocked on Libyan soil because Italy negotiated with Libyan warlords. Omar al-Bashir, who is indicted for crimes against humanity, Europe is dealing with him to hold back the migrants. Any African country that accepts to hold back migrants is getting money from Europe. So we laugh, and you're right to laugh, at Trump, who's building this imaginary wall, but Europe is building a wall of money around itself. And we try to get rid of the people. So I'm very pessimistic, because the answers that were found are answers where you outsource our responsibility to police states around Europe, and you you actually enact what was happening in the Cold War. If you are our ally, we will give you development aid. We didn't look whether there was development coming out of that. If you were Mobutu and you stole the money, no problem. You were in the heart of Africa, 11 countries around. We gave you more money after we proved that you stole the money, no problem. We will exactly do the same with this, what I call the migratory rent, African governments will understand, if I promise Europe that I will hold back the migrants, I will get money. And then what you do every now and then, you open a little bit the faucet, the tap, and you let a few come in, a few tens of thousands, storm Melilla or Ceuta, and then you can be sure that the European Union will open its purse and give you more money. And when you need more money, you let a few more migrants. So we are in a very, very bad logic to actually confront the challenge of mass migration out of Africa. And I say that in a very undramatic way. Africa is going through this demographic transition. There will be many migrants, like there were many European migrants that went to the United States. Instead of acknowledging that and now not looking to have a love relationship with Africa and think Africans are part of our families, I'm just looking for neighborliness. Africa is our neighbor. Whatever happens, we have to get along with them. Not more, not less. It's like going in a collective bus in Africa. You would want no one else to come in, but people come in each time this bus stops, and all you have to do is you make space. You have to put up with it because you could be the person standing out there and you want to go on. That's exactly what I think should be the beginning of a migratory policy, to understand that this neighborhood will not go away and that the problems in Africa are also our problems, so we have to make room, but we don't want to break down either. And find that middle ground. That's why I was so enthusiastic about Spain. I never said that I had a grand design, an answer to that challenge. It can only be a little bit of that, a little bit of that. Yes, a little bit more border security. Many liberals and left-wing people are wrong about the question of, can you technically survey a border? Yes, you can, and we have proven it. You know, you pay money, you do things, but security will not be sufficient as an answer, and you will not end up shooting people because you want them to keep them out of Europe. So you have to find other things. But Spain did a little bit of everything. Integration, regularization, a little bit more security, talking to the Senegalese, talking to the Mauritanians, and they did sometimes a better job than the French in their former colonies. So I actually admired the Spanish way of muddling through. We have to get through the next 40 years without a catastrophe. And there won't be a wonderful solution, but we have to avoid the catastrophe. Now, obviously, since I wrote, Vox has come into being, and I think this is not because of migration. It is because the elites were late in addressing the challenge. In 2010, there was this strategic meeting of European countries. What are the challenges for the 10 years ahead? There was not a word about migration. And these people were sitting in Brussels, where half of the young generation is already of immigrant origin, which is not a problem. But if you can't see it and you don't address it, then it flies back at you as a populist and a nativist movement. When I was in Brussels discussing with people, and they said they had never put the word Islam in a document that dealt with migration. How blind can you be? I'm not Islamophobic or whatever, but that a sizable community of Muslims in Europe is a challenge. You need to acknowledge that. You need to talk to your population and come to democratic solutions. So one of the reasons why I think this sort of conversation is helpful is that we actually need to talk about what's happening and confront it instead of saying people who are against migrants are racist and xenophobic, or people who want to open the doors are irresponsible people who just want to prove that they have a soul and they will ruin our welfare state. We have to come to grips. That's basically what I think is the value of this sort of conversations.
For sure. Let's now open the floor for discussion. I'm sure there are many comments and questions. We can take 3 comments and questions per round, no? And you both are asked to comment and discuss on them. Yes, here.
Good afternoon. My name is Andres.
Sorry, we have a microphone, probably because it's being taped, so record that.
Hello.
Can you introduce yourself very briefly?
My name
Yes.
is Andrés Jiménez de Parga. I'm a lawyer of Movimiento por la Paz in the International Protection Program. And I just came back from spending 2 years in Africa, in particular in West Africa, in Togo. And I would like to say that I partially agree on the diagnosis about Africa and about the reasons why Africans would like to leave their countries, or about the causes or the reasons of migration. Okay? And I agree that there is a lack of expectation and an idea of wanted to be part of the world. But the question, and maybe it's an obvious question, the one I would like to address, is we're focusing on Africa, we're focusing on migration, but the question I would like to address is what we could do or what we can do to improve the situation of African people in their own countries. Is there any kind of Marshall Plan that could be put in place or something like that? I mean, I would like to know about your opinion with respect because what I have heard today is the position, I mean, talking to about Africa from Europe. And with respect to migrants coming to Europe. But what we can do, developed countries, to improve the situation of Africa, of African countries, in order not to reduce a zero or to zero migration, because that's impossible, because that's a fact, but to improve this lack of expectation that most of African young people have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Some other comments here?
John Carlos Suari, University of Barcelona. I want to ask you, China has not been mentioned. And as far as I have read, I have been in Africa, but just to Morocco, so that never went down. So I heard that they are very active in Africa with a very different point of view of what you are saying. So I was in Brussels once with a responsible of development, of aid to development, and said, well, we had to do a railway, something like, and we are still discussing. They have done it in 1 year. So the activity of this very well emergent country, which is China, is it important in Africa in what we had been discussing? Thank you.
One last comment from this first round. Question? Okay, so, yeah, perfect.
My name is Hervé Ogou. I'm a political scientist at UAD, and I'm from...
I think the microphone doesn't
The micro
work.
doesn't work.
What?
The microphone.
The microphone.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Oh.
I say that...
A little bit louder then.
Okay, my name is Hervé Ogou Hervé, and I'm political scientist from Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. I'm from Ivory Coast. Okay. So my question is, why in Niger, we say that Niger is the one producer of uranium in Africa. So when the European countries go to Africa to make war, for instance, war in Libya, war in Ivory Coast, to put the political friends, how can you say that the Africans are going out of Africa because of demography? Why? How can you explain it? For instance, in Libya, the Libyan people were in Libya after the European war in Libya. There are no Libyans in Libya. They're out of Libya. And you say that they go out of Libya because of the problem of demography. I don't understand. For instance, I could say that, we are the first producer, cocoa producer. How many people take chocolate in Ivory Coast? But in Europe, coffee and cocoa is used by all the people. So the African people, when they go out of Africa, they are following the riches. They are following the way, they are following where European people come to take their riches to come in Africa. So, why do you say the African people go out to Africa because of demography, because they have plenty of people? Why?
Stephen? And then
let-
I'll give you.
Let me start with the last question, so I go the other way around. I hope I didn't say Africans leave because of demography. I thought I spoke a little bit about the reasons why Africans leave, because they seek better life chances, better education for their children, etc. Now, I understand your argument to be the lack of life chances and the insufficient condition in Africa are the responsibility of the Europeans robbing Africa. Yes. Or waging war in Africa. Now, I do not agree.
Making war.
Yes, I got that. Yes. Yes, yes. But, it is, we are not currently witness, if I agree on you saying that Europe wages war in Libya, and you could say that in 2011, Europe and the United States, but you didn't see, first of all, these would be refugees and not migrants, so we're not talking about the same thing. And for the time being, we don't have an influx of Libyan refugees/migrants. So that's not the problem. If in South Sudan, it's not the West waging war and people run away from South Sudan because that was a country that was created in 2011, and since 2013, they are killing each other, and so people run away. I don't see European involvement in that. Now, I'm perfectly happy with you thinking that all the misery in Africa is due to European interference, etc. That would probably explode our debate here to try to settle the question of responsibility. I do not deny post-colonial responsibilities. You can easily say that after 10 years of civil war in Ivory Coast, which was not waged with interference, the French interfered, but it didn't spark a migratory movement. People, since the beginning of this year, the number of Ivorians leaving the country has gone up despite the fact that global figures are down by 50%. And the country is one of the success stories in West Africa under President Ouattara. So I'm not saying that you're wrong. You have your opinion about Africa's exploitation, but it has no link with the migration issue that we are discussing. People are not running away from wars. These are refugees, and they are not coming in their numbers from Ghana, from Senegal, or from Kenya, or from South Africa because of Western exploitation. Now, the post-colonial responsibility, I think we have been discussing that ever since independence, since 60 years, and I will not be able to address that in 5 minutes. China, very quickly, there's 1 million Chinese living in Africa, in the African continent. China was the 83rd commercial partner of Africa in 1997 and is since 2006 the first partner of Africa. So you see the sort of rise. What is interesting about China is actually not as much as Chinese do not do something that other people could not do, but first of all, that China with 25% of the world population would secure a position in Africa that corresponds to its economic and demographic power should not surprise. They are actually only catching up. Europe has still more than 50% of the trade with Africa, that now China has 12% of imports out of Africa, and Chinese exports to Africa is 12%, and imports from Africa is 3%. So there's nothing spectacular. What's really interesting about China is 1 million people on the ground. The next community would be Lebanese or Indians. There is no European going to Africa. Europeans have a hotel room in Africa. There used to be 200,000 Europeans in Africa. They are down now to something like 80,000. So the human presence, Chinese in the next generation will know Africa because they have so many people who really experience Africa on the ground. And the second interest that I take in China is, no, they're third. The second is they say what they want. They don't come with a mission to civilize. They say, I want this, now tell me what you want. What do you want in exchange? And Africans like it because we go in and we say, listen, I really want you to I want to make life better for you. And in addition, I would like to have your oil. They prefer the Chinese saying, I want your oil. And I can understand them. We have this missionary impulse. We say the mission to civilize under colonialism was a bad thing. But almost all Europeans have an idea about how to make life better in Africa. And I think they, knowing so little about what it actually means to live in Africa, that is a wrong approach. The Chinese say, I want this. I don't want to change you. I don't want to make you a black Chinese, like the French tried to turn Africans into black Frenchmen. They don't do that. They say what they want, and sometimes they have conflicts, like we do have conflicts, but they are less hypocritical. And the third aspect that I'm interested in when it comes to China is put yourself into the shoes of an African. What's the difference between talking to a Westerner and a Chinese? If I were an African, I look at the Chinese and I think, wow, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, this was an underdog. And today, when the Chinese president is coming to the Washington, I really take my word for it. It reminds me of an American president coming to Berlin when I was studying in the 1980s. Everything stands still. The most important person comes to Washington. This is the Chinese president. He holds a third of the foreign debt of the United States. That's an important person. If I were African, I would say, they did that in 1 or 2 generations. There's hope for me. I can do that as well. And in addition, the Chinese will not preach me any moral lessons about what I should do, how I should live, because that's basically colonialism. If you know better how other people should live, you have a colonial mindset. And I have never met as many missionaries as I meet in Europe, because everybody has an idea about how Africans should actually live. I hope that was brutal enough. Okay, good. No, I'm very strong. I mean, I'm really a little bit aggressive on that. Not aggressive, I hope, but I really think the Chinese is being played up by people who are afraid about competition, and the Chinese are just competing, catching up with the Europeans. But we do not think enough about the psychological difference between Chinese or Brazilians or other Turks going into Africa in a very different way from ours. We pretend that we will get our economic benefit and improve life for Africans in Africa. Let us be a little bit more modest. Let's say we just go there and defend our interests and ask Africans to do exactly the same. And they can shop, they can choose between Chinese partners, Brazilian partners, the Italians or the Germans, and they can make an advantage out of that competition. My final word is, that was the most difficult question, that's why I saved it for the end. What can Europe do to improve the situation in Africa? As you know, it's not about being a missionary. It's very difficult because, as I said, even if you managed African countries well, it was very difficult, given the demographic transition, to somehow succeed. How can you school all these young people? It takes 18 years, and half of the population in Africa is renewed. That means that if you go back 18 years, that would be 9/11, the attacks on the World Trade Center. Half of the population today in Africa has no lived experience of 9/11, not to talk about the Cold War or colonialism. The political horizon is very low. If you start an infrastructure project today that will be completed in 20 years, half of the population is not yet born that will actually potentially benefit from that. So the turnover, the generational turnover is such that it's very difficult to have real impact. Development aid, if it worked, it does not really work well. But if it worked, you have to pay development aid. It will increase migratory pressure, but you will develop Africa faster, and in the long term, people will want to stay at home. But we don't know how to create development. We are just throwing money at a problem, and it doesn't work. So I don't know what non-Africans can actually do. Fair trade agreements, many of the things that probably you will criticize in European attitudes, forms of unfairness, we can remove them, give better chances to Africa. But beyond that we would better know how to develop Africa than Africans, I really don't believe in that. So throwing money at Africa only increases corruption and wastage. Sometimes people benefit from it because there's some money, and some individuals will benefit, not through corruption, really benefit from it. But we have not sparked development. And the part of the world that has developed over the last decades, this is China, India, places that did not get development aid. So millions of people were lifted out of poverty, but not in the places where we gave development aid. That should get us start thinking, I believe.
Rafael.
Yeah, I would not be saying anything about China because I think it's a very perfect explanation what Stefan said. And regarding the wars and the implication of Europe and so on, we will tend to agree on many issues. But again, I mean, opening right now the discussion about the war and so on would be taking us a big picture. But you are then coming to your first question. You are coming from Côte d'Ivoire, aren't you? Who is defining the currency policy in Côte d'Ivoire? Who is defining currency policy in Côte d'Ivoire? Who is defining? Who is deciding on the currency policy there? France, that's it. Bank of France. So to keep the CFA, you have to give part of your assets to the Bank of France. So we still keep some issues that we might consider as, let's say, at least critical in the way in which we deal with Africa. And that we come to the missionary issue. So that you can become a kind of a stable country, then you have to leave your assets in the Bank of France, or 50% of your assets in a way. For the Franco CSR. This affects to 17 countries in Africa, to all the Francophonie with CFA. That's one issue. Fiscality, it's another issue. But then probably you can say you are copying what it's being done in Europe. Yes, it is. But so far, the big benefiters of the fiscal capacity in Africa, it's normally Western countries. It's not Africa. So there are still some trends in colonial capacity of thinking that we need to do differently. Whether these would be used in Africa better or not, that's another question. We don't know how prepared it is. I was very confident in South Africa with Mandela. I'm not that much confident today, but in any case, it's their choice. But for us, I think that we have to figure out many issues still which are not, let's say, fair enough in the way we deal with Africa. So trade issues, fiscal issues, way of not keeping them kind of in our sphere of influence and so on. Still, I think that we have to do a good reflection on whether those are the good policies.
Where are the money to mention Mobutu? Where is the money?
The Mobutu? Yes. Probably in Switzerland. In Congo, there would be some in Congo.
The money of Mobutu is in Swiss, in Europe.
Yes.
Okay,
yeah, well, I mean, I never tried to work on where... Can I just finish my sentence? I never tried to find out where Mobutu's... I knew Mobutu very well. I don't know where his money is. But, you know, you can always turn the tables in this sort of discussions. And, you know, $300 billion are outside of the Maghreb, and they are the possession of Maghrebi elites. And many African elites put their money abroad. Now, I will not say this, can I hold this against Europe? I think we conceded the argument that if you want to believe that Africa has no agency, that President Ouattara is not governing his country, you are free to believe that. And you can think that France is just putting in a president and taking a president out. You're free to believe it. I don't share that opinion, but I respect that opinion. I think it's factually not correct, but you can think that. But then you would need to agree that the outside world has a lot of power, and when they try to remove a president like President Mugabe, they have been trying for years and they never succeeded. So you need to explain why in one way they can put in any president and in other circumstances they can't remove them. But I don't believe that Africa is just under the control of outside countries. Yeah.
But because you mentioned Ouattara,
yes.
let's speak about Ouattara.
But perhaps not. Yes, okay.
Bagolora wanted to create our money. Not from the French come making war in Ivory Coast to put his own friends. Do you understand?
Stephen, one last word to finish, sentence to finish this presentation.
We can. I'm very happy to talk with you after this this meeting, and we can spend the evening together discussing Bagbo and Ouattara. No problem. I'm not saying this. I'm saying this honestly. I'm really prepared to do it.
Because Europe put security in Europe, put insecurity out of Europe.
Okay, we will discuss that over dinner. Okay.
Yeah.
If I had something to say, first of all, and it's not just a formula, so sort of closing remark, I'm very grateful, first of all, for the turnout, because I always know we do that all the time. We try to have discussions at Duke University and we end up with 20 people, etc. So I'm really grateful for you coming. That sounds very trivial. I'm also very grateful for my interlocutors. And overall, I think, at least from my perspective, this has been a wonderful opportunity to exchange. I don't think there are easy answers to the questions that are raised, and that it is particularly difficult, even in 1 or 2 hours, to convey experience. You can give a few facts, but it's very difficult to share experience. And experience is the background that allows you to make real choices. So what we are trying to do is a lot of work, and I hope that this will be ongoing work. I sometimes get reviews. Some reviews are very, by the way, I just realized here in Spain, they always say he got an award from the French government. I feel a little bit uneasy about that. I myself,
it's there.
Yeah, I know. No, it's my editor, my publisher. I will discuss it with him. But the Académie Française gave an award, etc. As an immigrant, I'm very proud of that. But what I basically think is this sort of conversation has a sense, because then you can go out and actually listen to people who find that they have lived in their neighborhood that has so quickly changed that they sometimes feel like migrants. And they don't necessarily. I know racists and there are xenophobes, and you know that as well as I do. But we have to come to a point where the conversation is possible between the migrants and the people who are already here and who are not natives. They are just citizens of a country, and other people can become citizens. My last word is, I think there is no problem about, if I can word it that way, an Africanization of Europe, as long as Africans come to Europe to live as Europeans. And live as Europeans doesn't mean they need to live like I live right now. With the influx of migrants, to live in Europe will also change, and that's normal. No identity is a product. Identity is a production. So with the influx, the way of living in Europe will change. But you have to accept as a migrant that you go to a place not to earn money European way and live your way in an enclave, in a diasporic community. If Africans come to Europe to live as Europeans, as new Europeans, then Africa will still be in Africa and Europe will still be Europe, and everything will be fine. Great Britain, two generations ago, London, roughly 8 million people. 90% of the population were British, of British parents and grandparents. Today, half of London is first or second generation immigrants. London is still London. London is a wonderful place to be, but you have to be careful. The rest of Great Britain feels that London is not entirely their capital any longer. So there is a middle ground to hold, not to panic, but also to acknowledge that some people get into moral panics about a pace of change that is just too fast. End of story.
Rafa.
Yeah, very brief, because I think that Stephen should be signing some books and so on. But in any case, I just wanted to say, because here we have already discussed for 1 hour and a half and bring some challenging issues, because that's the way to discuss, otherwise there was no. And some of you might have the impression that this is kind of against immigration and so on. I'm just going to finish with one sentence that I cannot be more in agreement with, which is saying, sin inmigración no hay ningún desafío a las actitudes inveteradas ni placer en encontrar las maneras habituales de actuar. Desde el ángulo opuesto, cuando los habitantes de siempre se sienten invadidos, cortan los puentes, se vuelven a meter en su caverna identitaria y se convierten en trogloditas. Lo digo por si alguien pensaba que Stephen estaba contra la inmigración. Thank you very much, Stephen. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Stephen, for coming to Barcelona. Let me finish. I wanted to say thank you, Stephen, for coming to Barcelona and to CIDOB to present this book. Thank you, Rafa, for engaging with the presentation and the discussion. From the book, it comes out very clearly that their problems and their challenges are our problems and our challenges. I'm sure we all would agree on this, and this is also a starting point for the next discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.